So as we're developing traditions here in the South, what things or what activities in the soul food idea are indigenous and from Africans in America, or and ones that were associated with us being close to Europeans? Or what do we pick up from them?
Yeah. So the first thing to understand is that in West Africa, the typical meal is a savory soup, stew, or sauce served along or on top of a starch. So here we talk about being meat and potatoes. West Africans would say, no, we're potatoes and meat or something like just to show the role reversal. So a lot of one pot meals. I think a great example is maybe something like gumbo. Gumbo was an okra stew, so the okra is used as a thickener, and then other vegetables and other things were added to that. Now you put it in a New Orleans context, you start adding, foods from the Americas with a French influence, and it becomes something different. So you see a lot of fusion like that happening. Okay. But typically these one-pot meals and an adaptability with fried foods, so fritters and other things. And some say that the African expertise in frying led to the raising of fried chicken to an art form, even though my research indicates that fried chicken comes from Western Europe. So you can see okay, there's this dish in Western Europe that's used, enslaved African Americans and Africans are forced to cook this dish and just be given the expertise in deep fat frying, raise it to an art form. So you see a lot of play like that. But in many cases, you find West Africans trying to substitute the foods that they were used to in Africa with ingredients from the Americas. So for instance, instead of having tropical yams, different climate, you would eat sweet potatoes. That's one example.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So as we are developing these traditions, what about like dessert? I hear people talk I hear dessert like we eat like banana pudding and pound cake. Where are these dishes coming from?
Yeah. So that points to the complexity of soul food. So a lot of things that we think of as classic soul food desserts invented by Black people are actually have precursors in high-end European cooking. So sweet potato pie, that if you look at the seasoning and the method, that was very similar to an old dessert called carrot pie. In fact, Henry VIII was grubbing on sweet potato tartlets in the 1500s. Pound cake, old British dessert, long-standing. Banana pudding is based on the trifle. Again, a long-time British dessert with a bread and a cream element. So with banana pudding, the cream element is that custard you would make. Some do it with Jell-O pudding mix, but the custard you make. And then the bread component is the vanilla wafer cookies. And then bananas get added in the mix. So banana pudding, when it first comes out in the 1800s, is a high-end dish, man, because bananas were really expensive. So it was a wealthy person's dish. But for Africans, this idea of dessert is something alien to them because they didn't follow the European meal structure where you have an appetizer course, an entree, and then dessert or other courses. It was really just one pot meals. And maybe dessert would be some fruit afterwards, but still, it was just something different.
Interesting. So now we're talking about like specific habits and where they're coming from. Say that there was an enslaved African in the North. Would your traditions be different since you're on the coast? Like say you're in Maryland or I'm not going to say, or Washington, D.C., somewhere in this area.
Yeah.
Or Virginia. Well, Virginia's still considered the South. But
yeah.
As we travel further up north, we're on the coast. Or say even North Carolina, you're on the coast here. Are you eating seafood then since you're on the coast? West Africa's on the coast. Yeah. So how will the traditions look there?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So it kind of depends on where you're from along the West African coast. So if we could just quickly go down the coast. Yeah. So if you're in Senegal and Gambia, you're used to a rice-based diet. But as you move further down the coast, you're more typically going to have grains like sorghum and millet. And then when you move further, Nigeria, Angola, those areas, it's more root crop based. So what we see is after enslaved Africans arrive on the coast, they try to adjust, and they're using ingredients that are indigenous and trying to create this fusion food. But as time develops, we find the enslaved asking for food reminiscent of what they had back home. So up north, you're probably having cornmeal just because corn was so easy to raise. But as you move further south into rice country in the Carolinas and Georgia, you find a more rice-based diet. And you find dishes similar to what people were eating in West Africa. So one perfect example is something like hop and john, which is a combination of rice and black-eyed peas. And then what we find also in other parts of the South is the enslaved asking for sweet potatoes as their rations. Because typical rations on a week was 5 pounds of some starch, a couple of pounds of meat, smoked, dried, salted, whatever, and then a jug of molasses. And the enslaved had to figure out how to supplement that diet. So we find a lot of diversity in the starches based on where people are from. So if you're from Senegal and Gambia, you wanted rice predominant in your rations. If you're from further parts south, you either had cornmeal as a substitute for the sorghum and millet grains, or the sweet potatoes instead of yams.
It's interesting. So, what about like heading out west? And what type of traditions would you see like out west with like enslaved African escaping?
Yeah.
What type of traditions would you see there?
Yeah. So what you find is typically people moving out west, escaping from slavery, are kind of transporting a southern diet out there because that's what they were used to. But they're doing it in a different context. And so if they come to a new place, and let's just say they come to a place like San Francisco that had an established Asian population, primarily Chinese immigrants, what you find is that these migrants would start to have more pork infused Chinese dishes. So they're trying to get something similar to what they had back home, but just in a different context. And a lot of people switching to beef. But because of the status that African Americans had in society, often was eating at the lower end of the socioeconomic class. So it was like really, undesired cuts of meat. In California, you have stories of people eating salmon bellies. So a lot of stuff that stockyards or these food processing companies would throw away, you find enslaved people eating those things.
Gotcha.
And as they became more prosperous, then they tried to have the celebration food of the old country, which was the American South.